let's try something new. I'm going to talk about a poem today. Basically, I like poetry, and it's relatively easy stuff to put together to make a video I'll enjoy making. So today's poem is going to be Old Time Childhood in Kentucky by Robert Penn Warren. Penn Warren was, I think, I've got it here, 1905 to 1989, I think. Um, and he was the first poet laureate of America, 1986. A very important poet and writer and general man of letters and occasional philosopher, political journalist, things like that. Very interesting figure, much more complicated than I think a cheap account of his life will give either way. A really interesting guy. And an interesting poet, not an absolute top tier poet in my opinion, not an all time great, but very, very gifted. Weird thing in terms of this is a weird thing I only found out last night was he was David Milk's mentor, David Milk of NYPD Blue, and most famously probably Deadwood, in terms of his creation of it. So yeah, very strange. But he was his mentor before Milk moved from academia into TV writing. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read this. I've got one note up, and I will. Basically, what we'll do is I'll read it, then I'm going to annotate it and discuss what's going on technically, just so that we know, and then just pick up on a few themes and ideas it struck me with. By the way, the edition I have of his works or poems is the Robert Penn Warren Reader, which is 1987 or something like that. This is a great one. I got it second hand. It's got library covers on, and it is ex-library from the Cholla Public Library in Phoenix, Arizona, and it has, rather than a stamp kind of thing, it has a little kind of bookmark almost, which is that it's to be returned on the 22nd of the month, which is a nice simple way of doing it. He's actually, his most famous writing is probably not in here. It is All the King's Men, about about a figure much like Huey Long, of which two films have been made, including I think it won a Pulitzer. And did the film win some Oscars? Maybe. Anyway, Old Time Childhood in Kentucky. This is from a late work. He's writing in his 80s at this point. When I was a boy, I saw the world I was in. I saw it for what it was: canebrakes with track beaten down by bear paw, tobacco in endless rows, the pink inner flesh of black fingers crushing to green juice tobacco worms plucked from a leaf. The great trout, motionless, poised in the shadow of his enormous creek-boulder, but the past and the future broke on me as I got older. Strange, into the past I first grew. I handled the old bullet mould. I drew out a saber, touched an old bayonet. I dreamed of the death scream. Old spurs I tried on. The first great General Jackson had ridden just north to our state to make a duel legal or avoid the law. It was all for honour. He said I would have killed him, even with the hot lead in my heart. This for honour. I longed to understand. I said the magic word. I longed to say it aloud, to be heard. I saw the strategy of Bryce's crossroads, saw the disposition of troops at Austerlitz, but knew it was far away long ago. I saw the marks of the old man's stick in the dust, heard the old voice explaining. His eyes weren't too good, so I read in the books he wanted, read and Breasted's History of Egypt. Saw years uncoil like a snake. I built a pyramid with great care. There interred Pharaoh's splendour and might. Excavation next summer exposed that glory to man's sight. At a cave mouth, my uncle showed me crinoid stems, and in limestone skeletons of the fishy form of some creatures. All once underwater, he said, no saying the millions of years. He walked off, the old man still with me. Grandpa, I said, what do you do, things being like this? All you can, he said, looking off through treetops skyward. Love your wife, love your get, keep your word, and if need arises, die for what men die for. There aren't many choices, and remember the truth doesn't always live in the number of voices. He hobbled away. The woods seemed darker. I stood in the encroachment of shadow. I shut my eyes, head thrown back, eyelids black. I stretched out the arm on each side, and water-like, wavered from knees and hips, feet yet firm fixed, it seemed, on shells, in mud, in sand, in stone, as though, in eons back, I grew there in that submarine depth and lightlessness, waiting to discover what I would be, might be, after ages, how many, had rolled over. So it is a reminiscence about his childhood, is reminiscence about his grandfather, who's very important to him, and he writes other poems about his grandfather. His grandfather was a Confederate veteran, an interesting figure because he wasn't a secessionist and he was anti-slavery, but his explanation to his grandson was, in those days, you went with your people. You know, he understood that he was going with his people and doing so. So there's this dual legacy that shows up in Penn Warren dealing with the sort of political and racial past of his past. Here, we do have one mention of that here, by the way. The issue of, we're talking about sharecroppers here, probably, or agricultural servants in the early 1900s, plucking tobacco. So, what you'll notice, if you're, hopefully you enjoyed that. If you didn't, you may get more out of it as we look at it. What you notice is this is something I would just call this, free verse, vers libre, which certainly was in the background of Penn Warren's poetical roots. Modernism was something which the fugitive poets of Vanderbilt University and their friends adopted in part, and you see this in people like Eliot and Pound, and indeed one member of the fugitive circle was Robert Gould Fletcher. Is that his name? John Gould Fletcher maybe, who was a poet and historian, who was one of the imagists with people like Ezra Pound and others, in that kind of circle of imagists and modernists in Europe, often American. Amy Lowell as well in the early 1900s. So he was associated with those people, and here, just to kind of give some examples, for instance, here, in terms of syllable counts, there are 12 syllables, but on the next you got 10, and on the next you've got 10. Some of this is going to depend on pronunciation, and certainly, for instance, the last rhyme, discover and over, sounds slightly truer rather than it being a half rhyme, really, or an assonance. It sounds truer in Penn Warren's accent. You can listen to him. He's on YouTube. He's got plenty of videos with him speaking. There's 6 there. There's 10 here. There's 6 there. And there's 15. Whoops, that's awful. There we go. So you can see it's not particularly regular. Similarly, we don't have lots of rhymes. Most notably, you have the only true rhyme that is kind of sentence ending, line ending, is at the end of each verse. You have boulder, older, word, heard. You've got might and sight there. You have, in fact, this I notice is has not copied true. That's how that goes. That's a different line. So yeah, you can see choices, voices, and many choices as a line. It's 3.5 syllables. You've not got very much there. Discover and over. You can see that there are these these line-ending rhymes at the end of each verse. Otherwise, there are no line-ending rhymes, and there is no rhyming pattern beyond that. That AA at the end of verse 1, BB, and so on at the end of verse 2. There are lots of other little kind of technical things he's using to make it sound good. Repetition, past, tobacco, for instance. And there are also some, plenty of half rhymes or quarter rhymes or whatever. There's a little tiny bit of alliteration, for instance, feet yet firm fixed. But you also have half rhymes, hips to fixed, for instance, there. And others. As I say, you've got plenty of repetition. Honor is a common one, as is longed. You have this kind of saw, but that is bookended by heard and heard up in front and behind it. And in fact, there is a new in the middle, which feels like possibly it's doing its own job or its own thing. It's a third way of engaging with reality. So, yeah, you can see there's lots of things he's using to achieve poetic effect, both the actual rhymes, but also a lot of sub effects. It is also tracking. It's not pure in this way, and that's the whole point about free verse libre, is that it didn't try to in a poetical way replicate speech patterns. By that I mean basically in English, it didn't use iambic pentameter, which is almost the natural mode of speech in English. That's why it sounds so good to us. But it is natural rhythms. So it has no set rhythm. There's no set meter. We would say, we go a meter, tum-ty, 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 tum, the kind of rhythm of a line in official terms. But because the emphases might come anywhere, and especially because these wildly different syllable counts, 13, 10, 10, 13, 11, 6, 10, 6, 15, you can't require a certain number of emphases or main beats. Iambic pentameter has 5. Hexameter has 6. The great Greek verse form. In terms, it has that many feet, we'd say, and that many emphases. So when I was a boy, I saw the world I was in. So there, you could depending on how you stress that, you could only be using the eyes as strong sounds. But it does sound like something someone says. When I was a boy, I saw the world I was in. Or again, I drew out a saber, touched an old bayonet. I dreamed of the death scream. There are a couple of instances of internal rhyme as well. But even though it rhymes, it sounds like something someone could say. This is not a prose poem or a poetic piece of prose. It is verse, and it's using these line breaks to create stress. So, for instance, I drew out a saber, touched an old bayonet. I dreamed of the death scream. You hit this strong stress on the of because of the line break. So this is verse, and it is using the process of verse, and it's allowing itself to kind of do certain things due to the fact it's in verse. Now, what is going on? So that's just maybe that's all boring to you, but what is going on beyond the technical? Well, this is an old man. He's an old man at this point, and that's not necessarily something you need to know to enjoy or engage, but I think it's useful to know that this is an old man writing about his youth. And he writes many times about his youth at this time, in his 80s, late 70s and 80s. He's writing about being a young man. And the issue of time is important here. He starts off here, verse 1. A big theme here is this is in the present. By that I mean he's engaging with the world in the present, not that he's writing it in the present. So he says, when I was a boy, I saw the world I was in. I saw it for what it was. These are, though they are past tense, saw and was, they're about what it was at the time. They are about a present engagement with it as a young boy. But the past and future broke on me as I got older. So from a kind of motionless and engage or only being there in the present and never anyone else, never moving through time, only ever in the present. He engages with the past and future, and that's why this past, strange, into the past I first grew. Growing is a future act. It's something that happens to you in the future. I will grow up. You might say I did grow up, but what I mean is the process of growing is the continuous thing stretching into the future. But he grows into the past, and then for 2 verses, we hear about the past. We hear about, this is President Andrew Jackson, the first great General Jackson, the second being Thomas Stonewall Jackson. It was all for honour. He said, I would have killed him even with his hot lead in my heart. This for honour. I long to understand. I said the magic word. I long to say it aloud to be heard. There is this thing where he's engaging with a past that is alien to him, but fascinating. Honour. What does honour mean if it means that Andrew Jackson was riding into Kentucky to avoid the law and would have killed, was desperate to kill his man? Yeah. These things, the saber, the bayonet, the bullet mold, these are his grandfather's artifacts of riding in the Confederate cavalry, battle, this kind of that classic, often quite boyish engagement with how do you first deal with death? Often is, through the deaths of relatives, perhaps, but I suspect for many people, especially many young boys, it's also through this idea of battle, and that battle is this glorious, terrible thing with this result or results, many results, different for each person that you don't understand. So this idea that he grows into the past and is as if when we are growing, we're trying to understand the world. He's trying to understand the past, and he learns about military history. But I knew it was far away, long ago. I saw the mercs of the old man stick in the past, heard the old voice explaining. So we again have old. His eyes weren't too good. This stuff actually, you begin to see the, not a dismissal. I mean, Penn Warren was his part-time historian at points. He certainly was fascinated by the past and had great reverence for the past when engaged with seriously and honestly. But there is the thing here where maybe we see this, though he's still learning about the past, we do see that he can't live there. I read in books he wanted Egypt, saw years uncoil like a snake, and then this idea that did he actually build a pyramid? What did he actually inter there? Who knows? But the idea that he sees excavation showing us things again. There's a process of history. There's a process also of decay there. Like, we learn history, but also we see history decay. And then here, this is the key verse, really. Verse 4 is the key verse, I think. Because it's one that involves something horribly like a thesis, but it's funny because it's not, it's something until you think about what this means. This is still as a child, of course. Why is there just this quote from Grandpa, which is an order, a direction? His uncle is showing him crinoid stems, and in limestone skeletons. Let's just correct that. In limestone skeletons of the fishy form of some creature. In limestone skeletons. All at once underwater, saying the millions of years. He walked off, the old man still with me. Grandpa, what do you do things being like this? All you can, he said, looking off through the treetops skyward. Love your wife, love your get, keep your word, and if need arises, die for what men die for. There aren't many choices, and remember that truth doesn't always live in the number of voices. So, this idea that past isn't just the Civil War, isn't just to Napoleon, it goes all the way back to the pharaohs, and before that, millions of years back to, so his uncle says of these skeletons that he sees. This is overwhelming at some level, and that's interesting. Presumably that is why he says, Grandpa, what do you do things being like this? The like this feels like it has to be the millions of years. And that might sound strange, but this idea that though he wants to understand the past, it's so vast and distant. And, how do you understand anything, and Grandpa says, you do all you can. Love your wife, love your get, keep your word if need arises, die for what men die for. There aren't many choices, and remember that truth doesn't always live in the number of voices. So this is something which is how he integrates this existential crisis. An existential crisis we all have at different points, often multiple ones. An obvious one is often, in whether it's your teens, your 20s, your 30s, having that first great morbidity crisis. But here, it's not necessarily about morbidity, but it is about the way in which it feels like you're utterly insignificant in the face of something. It could be in the face of a mighty state, or it could be in the face of death, or it could be in the face of time. Here it's time. Whatever it is, whether it's politics or the human condition or the sheer spread of history, we face these crises, and we have to have a response. And this is not. It's worth saying that this is where you get existentialism from. One thing to say, and you see, with some existential. This is the big question: what does existence mean in the face of this confusing world, which is not always open to noetic understanding or whatever? And an answer is, well, at some level you have to work out how to define it. That's existentialism, if you like, in a nutshell. And you might have that be a classic, you kind of get to decide what the meaning of your life is, or it could be Camus. You have to decide not. You have to decide to live. You have Suicide seems like the only option for Camus, but the choice to live conquers that. Or it could be Gabriel Marcel and the idea, well, the chief ontological datum, he says, is love. These responses to this question of the vastiness of everything. And Grandpa is a bit more practical than that. He says, you do what you can. What do? You do what you can. You know there are things you can do, and in fact, implicitly, you ought to do. You ought to love your wife. You ought to love your children. You ought to keep your word. And if need arises, die for what men die for. He doesn't just mean statistically what they die for, but he means there is something you intuit that is right to die for. Why did he go to fight for a cause where he did not agree with the cause? Well, he actually went to fight for his people, as he went to be with his people. And yes, I think that's that's something which may or may not make sense to us, but it's something which is a simple creed. And then the point being, there aren't many choices. You think there are many choices. You think there are many options. But ultimately, things boil down, in the vastness of everything, they boil down to these kinds of choices. And truth does not always live in the number of voices. Don't worry about the fact that other people, including many other people, maybe many other people say you're wrong. This code gives you a guide in the face of that. And I think of Churchill's eulogy for Neville Chamberlain, where he says, whatever we might think of his actions, he did them sincerely. And given how quickly the view of history changes, Churchill says, that is the best you can ever do, the best judgment you can make. And I think Penn Warren's grandfather is saying that, and I think Penn Warren is saying that. I think that is what he thinks. Finally, just this last verse is an oddity because it's this is a response from him to his grandfather, isn't it? The number of voices we end with. That could have been a way to dramatically end, but actually we have things slightly different. He hobbled away, the wood seemed darker. So he's looked skyward through the treetops, to heaven, into the vastness of space. Where? The woods seemed darker. Life seemed darker. Suddenly I realised, not because of what his grandfather said, I don't think that's what's going on. It's actually the despair of what you do, things being like this. He's grown up. Now he has to think about his own actions. And in some sense, though this continues to think about the past, there's a sort of tense transition to what he's going to do in the future. I stood in the encroachment of shadow. I shut my eyes, head thrown back, eyelids black. I stretched out the arm on each side, and water-like wavered from knees and hips. Feet yet firm fixed. It seemed on shells and mud, in sand and stone, as though... Again, half rhymes. In eons back, I grew there in that submarine depth and listlessness, waiting to discover what I would be. Future. So now we've hit the future, haven't we? I had rolled over. After how many ages had rolled over? Basically, what would it be? So, for instance, in the future, will I be fossilized? He doesn't just mean that, though that is part of what he's dealing with. You might say, well, he's just responding to that. But obviously it's something more. It's that he's beginning to do that process of turning the past into the future in himself. And this code is the sort of the lever, the pivot, I guess. Anyway, that's just some thoughts about that, some technical thoughts, some I think my ideas about what the poem might mean, and I really like this. I do think one other thing to say, actually, finally on the technical note, belatedly, is if you want to sign that this is in a post-romantic, modernist tradition particularly, it's the idea that there are often quite visceral, vivid images, think about imagism, indeed, but which are not... they are not what we think of as classical poetry, but they are very poetic, I think. And I think good examples are this, the crinoid stems and limestone skeletons of the fishy form of some creature Or again, I grew there in that submarine depth and lightlessness, waiting to discover what I would be, might be after ages. It's not incredibly descriptive. It's not incredibly rich in poetic words, but where it does have them, it's often in the direction of being quite pungent, quite vivid. So yes. Anyway, you tell me what you think in the comments, and I'll see you next time.